Sonic the Hedgehog. To be honest, one of my favorite game series, I'd say, if not my favorite. I think its golden days are and have been behind him for a long time, but despite that, I cannot avoid talking about this series, talking about these games that I love so much, even if they constitute such a small part of this series, specifically 1991 through 1997. However, in between all my Sonic talk, there's something that I've been neglecting to talk about, or well, I might have talked very briefly about it a couple of years ago, but didn't receive much attention, so I wanted to revisit this topic. Some of you may remember that a couple of days ago I made a video about the questionable politics of sport, and that video did pretty well, especially on my English channel. I didn't have any plans to make any other videos talking about politics after that video. However, something happened quite literally the next day after publishing it. I encountered a pretty funny image, a Sonic Twitter image, and I thought it might make a good case study to talk a little bit more about politics on the channel. Specifically, what I thought when seeing this image was, this image is so reactionary. And I don't mean that in the sense that the creator of this image supports reactionary movements or anything like that. I'm talking about the fact that the image displays a pretty reactionary way of thinking. That's what I would like to talk about in this video. The ways in which Sonic fans have similar patterns of thinking to contemporary reactionary movements in the real world, even if these Sonic fans might not necessarily be reactionary or right-wing themselves. Before starting, I think it's important to answer the question, what even is reactionary thinking? I'll now quickly go over the 6 points of reactionary thinking. Point 1. Victim complex. Point 2. Idealization of the past. Point 3. Moral or social police. Point 4. Resistance to change or innovation. Point 5. Emotional reasoning over rational. Point 6. Us versus them narratives. These will be expanded upon throughout the video. Clever viewers may have noticed that reactionary thinking is very childlike. Everything is black and white. All those who disagree with me are the bad guys. My emotions dictate reality. An example of reactionary thinking exhibited in adults can be seen clearly in the Israeli victimization complex. Israel, being the aggressor of the conflict, paints themselves as a victim, not only of Hamas, but of any criticism. They think of it as a black and white, us versus them, good and evil, Palestinian versus Israeli conflict. I'd like to clarify for the next section that when making this comparison, I'm not saying that Sonic fans necessarily agree with these ideologies, or even that they're ideologically reactionary, but I would like you to pay attention to the Israel example and the logic behind it, not the specific rhetoric in question. Another point to mention is that, while the majority of conservative and fascist movements are reactionary, not all reactionaries are fascists or conservatives. What I would like to point out here is the fact that this way of thinking, which is similar to these movements' way of thinking, is harmful. Before continuing, I want to do a bit of shitstorm prevention and clarify a couple of things. I know some people, especially when we get to later parts of the video, might come away thinking that I'm a hypocrite, that I'm victimizing certain groups, acting as some kind of moral police, being overly emotional, or even framing this as a simplistic us versus them situation. But I think there's a fundamental difference between calling out harmful behavior with evidence and trying to censor others or silence dissent. This video isn't a personal attack or some kind of moral crusade. It's an invitation to think critically, not just about others, but about ourselves. Even well-intentioned people can fall into damaging ways of thinking, and it's worth talking about that openly. Any other reading of this video, aside from this one, to be blunt, is a willful misinterpretation. Finally, since we're talking about a series of commercial art, I wanted to make the point that the reactionary mind tends to see art similarly to what was previously described, with a binary black and white worldview, and therefore they generally don't understand the idea that art does not have objective measurable quality. This will not be relevant immediately, but in a section later in this video. Now that we have a framework to analyze this image, we can start our analysis.
Criticism is fine in a vacuum, but at a certain point, it just becomes the same talking points we've been hearing since 2022, drowning out any voices actually trying to discuss the franchise with any sort of excitement. Hot dog, taco, hamburger. It just gets tiring. People will say I'm trying to force them to mindlessly like everything, that I'm a corporate shill, that I'm shutting down discussion, etc. But the truth is, there is no discussion in this fandom anymore. It's the same discussion we've had time and time again, and we're just arguing in circles, begging desperately to break out. It's to a point where people bitch so much that when somebody finally forms an original criticism, it gets repeated so much in the next week that it completely loses all its value. When I see Sonic appearing in a game I love, I wish my first thought was, oh god, Sonic, and not, oh no, muzzle curve, I have to see people bitch about this now. I'm not a Sonic fan because I wanted to be upset all the time. I'm a Sonic fan because I want to be excited for new games and announcements. That's very hard to do when all I see is negativity. You are actively hampering others' ability to enjoy the franchise. You're adding nothing to the conversation, and clearly Sega isn't listening to you. This isn't toxic positivity, it's me being fucking tired. Jesus, man.
Okay, there's a lot to unpack here. In full, I believe the following points indicate of reactionary thinking in this image. Points 1, 3, 4, 5, and 6. So all but point 2. Point 1. The author has a very clear victim complex. Other people discussing the series in their own way and minding their own business doesn't allow him to enjoy the series his own way. There is as well a desire from the author to appear as the victim of the situation. Point 2. This point will come up later, as it's not relevant here. Point 3. The author implies that there is a correct way to discuss the Sonic series, which is also implied to be a way where more positive voices are heard. Reactionary voices often try to limit other people's speech. Point 4. The author shows resistance to the ever-changing Sonic discourse, especially when it's disagreeing with his perspective. We will go more in depth in the next section. Point 5. They use emotional reasoning over rational reasoning, not debating on the point specifically, but rather just complaining about it. Point 6. There's a clear us versus them mentality throughout the post. The usage of toxic positivity might be specifically referencing the argument made by Jeb from Jeb's Zone in his Sonic Frontiers review, and pitting it as a metaphorical them. This type of behavior isn't unique to this image. It's a type of behavior that is very common amongst many Sonic fans on this side of the discourse. Even self-professed leftists might sometimes have this underlying thinking. It's worth keeping in mind that it's not reactionary, or even inherently bad, to like new Sonic releases. The problem is when other people not doing so is utilized as a way to spin a narrative, and narratives are a thing to which we're going to be coming back to frequently later in this video. Aside from that, this type of reactionary thinking is bad, because the truth is, unlike what the post likes to pretend, there are different voices and opinions in this discussion. What's happening to this user is that he's in a Sonic Twitter bubble and cannot escape from it. According to the user, there are no new Sonic discussions in the fandom, and at the same time they want all discussions to adhere to their views of the series. This post isn't about being more accepting of positive opinions, it's about discarding negative ones. Precisely what the user says they aren't doing at the end of the post. This isn't toxic positivity. I think this is emblematic of a larger point I didn't mention about reactionary thinking up until now. The fear of the unknown, of what's outside of your personal bubble. I'm sure you've noticed this video is only halfway over. That's because I wanted to talk about a couple of more things that don't have to do with this image, but that are related to being a reactionary in the Sonic community. And this time, I'm not talking about a political reactionary. I'm talking about a very explicitly political reactionary. Finally, we can talk about who this video is actually about. Dimitri Monroe. Some of you who are familiar with Dimitri's content might be asking yourselves, Dimitri Monroe? A reactionary? Yes, I have enough evidence to believe that Dimitri Monroe is a reactionary, and possibly even with conservative tendencies.
We will get back to this point later.
The first time I noticed this was in his Sonic Frontiers video, where he states,
Here is this conversation.
I'm not just a damsel in distress anymore. Just you watch. Eventually, you'll be the one relying on me for help.
Amy Rose has never simply been a damsel in distress, and the times she has. Is it really such a bad thing? I know modern culture has attempted to gaslight everyone into thinking this is a dirty term, but I'm sorry, sometimes people need help.
Okay, a couple problems. For the record, I don't think the writing he criticizes in this section is good either. But unlike him, I don't spin my dislike of it into a culture war narrative. First of all, Amy was a damsel in distress many more times in the Sonic series. In Sonic Adventure, a game which Dimitri literally shows footage of, but also Sonic Adventure 2, where Amy is taken hostage by Eggman. In Sonic Rivals, she's also turned into a car that Sonic has to rescue? I'm sure there are more examples of this, but these are the ones that come to mind. That for starters. In regards to the rest, have you noticed how Dimitri intentionally uses footage of an Anita Sarkeesian video as he makes his point that quote-unquote modern culture has tried to quote-unquote gaslight everyone into thinking damsels in distress is a dirty term? I want you to take note of that for later. For now, I'll just say that this is clearly anti-SJW bullshit. On top of that, it's very clear to me that this contains many facets of reactionary thinking. Resistance to change, idealization of the past, us versus them, possibly more. And finally, the ending. I'm sorry, sometimes people need help. I'm sorry to be the bearer of bad news, but women are right in pointing to the fact that a lot of art, including video games, have historically been tailor-made to appeal to men, and that might make them uncomfortable. Not only because of what it says about women, but also because it's not good that art might reinforce harmful stereotypes. For Spanish viewers of this video, watching the Spanish version, from now on the script will be written in English and then translated into Spanish, so I apologize if anything doesn't sound as natural as usual. If you're watching the video in English, then pretend you didn't hear that. After seeing this frankly incredible display of intelligence by Monroe that can be literally disproven by a couple of paragraphs, I got inquisitive. So I decided to look more into what other beliefs Monroe might hold. And oh boy, let me tell you, this sent me down a rabbit hole. Remember when I said that Monroe has conservative tendencies? Well, after looking more into Monroe's beliefs, I can confidently state that it's not just conservative beliefs. It's full-on alt-right, even teetering on fascism. First, I decided to look into Monroe's Twitter, and while I didn't find any things he said in particular, I did find that he follows a lot of explicitly fascist accounts. I'll mention some of them by name. Crusader Pepe, White Excellence, this account, this other account, this third account, and many more. Not only that, but Monroe also made a video that sums up his beliefs quite well. The video is titled... Oh no. Your optics don't actually matter, the lesson Gamergate failed to learn. So, this video is interesting, to put it lightly. I'll link to Monroe's video below so you can be sure I'm not misrepresenting him. If I had to sum up what the video is about, it's specifically about how Monroe believes that Gamergate 2, a new quote-unquote movement, and totally not a follow-up to a harassment campaign, needs to learn a lesson from Gamergate 1, specifically about, well, what the title says, optics don't actually matter. I won't go over the entire video, but I will go over some of his specific points.
Even going back to Gamergate Classic, the movement was in fact started by someone receiving biased coverage for sexual favors, bringing a spotlight to the questionable ethics of gaming journalists. But surely, for such a statement to exist at the scale it did, this wasn't the only unethical coverage that took place in the industry. So the question becomes, what were the other concerns?
Everything is sexist, everything is racist, everything is homophobic, and you have to point it all out.
Been a while since I heard that one. But that really summarizes it well, doesn't it? The problems people had with the games journalist industry was the ideology pushing, demonizing games and their creators as sexist, bigoted, racist, as well as many other terms if it didn't fall in line with their left-wing political views, and generally pushing for a certain narrative in the industry by only propping up what falls within these politics, instead of honest coverage. Admitting this doesn't mean you wouldn't have an issue if the politics were reversed, but to claim no political basis is you obfuscating the problem.
In this clip, Monroe admits that Gamergate was explicitly political, unlike what people like to pretend, which ironically he is right about but not in the way he wants it to be. He earlier in the video establishes his disappointment with Gamergate 2 by saying that he thinks that members of the quote-unquote movement shouldn't worry about optics, that's to say, worry about being considered racist, homophobic, or bigoted in any way. Basically just be a full-on fascist. Here's that clip.
Whereas with the coverage continuing to escalate, the Gamergate 2 moniker would be adopted from both sides of the argument, and with that title, returned all the same malignant issues that ended up derailing the original Gamergate into becoming ineffective and irrelevant, instead of maintaining momentum in bringing awareness to the slimy business practices of games journalists, and the ideological rot infestation in the games industry. The numerous grifters who attached themselves to the movement instead cared more about protecting their brand image. Discourse moved away from talking about legitimate issues and their causes to responding to whatever claim the media leveraged against Gamergate participants that week. We're not sexist, we actually love diversity, you're the real racist, became the calling cards of every YouTuber who waited on the topic after just a few months. And the same thing is starting to occur again. This can already be found in the Steam group this all started from. You'll find post after post from the average users up to moderators actively defending the goals of Sweet Baby, simply stating that the actual problem is the company's approach. Any discussion of said company's politics is met with banning or punishment, trying to downplay the very existence of such a thing.
He also cites Mr. Medeker as a positive example that the Gamergate 2 quote-unquote member should follow, Mr. Medeker being a prolific fascist online figure.
Even the main figurehead who brought such attention to the original Gamergate was Mr. Medeker, a man who's on the complete opposite side of the political spectrum, with his career being garnered over mocking SJWs and his original Quinspiracy series. The movement has a political basis any way you look at it.
The rest of the video is frankly just culture war garbage, and it frankly has no bearing on the topic of this video, so we're just going to move on from it. It would be a waste of everyone's time to address every single point in the video. However, another thing I wanted to mention is that it would seem as if Monroe uncritically accepts the premise of Gamergate 1, that being that there used to be unethical gaming journalism, when in reality, the one example that they can provide is just that, one example. Everything else is basically related to the idea that we talked about earlier in the video. The idea that reactionaries tend to have this view of objective quality in art, and when a review doesn't reflect their view of a piece, they see it as unethical. To wrap this back around, while I won't go over concrete examples, the video exhibits clearly points 2 and 4, those being the idealization of the past and the resistance to change. This can be seen specifically when he honed in on San Andreas as a game that they couldn't make today, paraphrasing this, as well as his rejection of Sweet Baby Inc. and broadly a changing, more progressive media and society. So, here's my final thoughts. I think Sonic fans ought to be careful, not only of the way that they think, but also of the fact that there are many people in the Sonic community who are reactionaries. Monroe is the biggest example, but I could have brought up other examples as well. However, I also think that as a Sonic fan who is opposed to the view expressed in the image that I branded as reactionary, my side of the argument is also not free of any blame either. In fact, while I don't think I'm a reactionary, I think people on my side of the community and discussion ought to be careful with how they make critiques of modern Sonic games. I mention this not because I think there's anything reactionary with critiquing modern Sonic games, but rather because as someone who often critiques them from the perspective of the classics, and know many other creators that do, I think we should be careful around the way that we frame and word our critiques. To give an example with my own content, in my Sonic Frontiers Revisited video, there's a section when I rant very negatively about the game's music, while saying that Sonic music hasn't been good since 1997. However, the poor framing of this could be seen as reactionary, even if I intended it as a joke. I think we ought to be careful because we don't want people to fall into fascist or conservative griftospheres, because they saw a Sonic video that argued that older Sonic games were far better. Of course, the creators shown on screen previously, like me, clearly aren't reactionary. They've shown understanding that their opinion is just their opinion. They don't have a black and white view of things, and they clearly demonstrate a desire for innovation. But it is concerning to me how, on a surface level, someone could interpret my analysis as simply wanting a return to the past, or reactionary values, and even worse, agree with said position. What makes it worse being that, watching Monroe's video on Frontiers, with the exception of the anti-feminist remarks, I don't necessarily disagree with any of it myself. But that's the problem. These types of critiques aren't incompatible with how actual reactionaries think. Being critical of new games and liking old ones is very much compatible with an idealization of the past. The only thing that separates me from Dimitri Monroe in that sense is that I, and other creators like me, don't use this critical lens as a means to spin a culture war narrative and harm minorities. That's why, from now on, I'll strive to make my positions very clear. I am not a reactionary. As for fans who might agree with the image's sentiment, in the same way as people on my side of the argument, there are some aspects of your thought that are reactionary too. So please, if you care about welcoming people into this community, please try to learn from this video. The Sonic community has a reactionary problem, sure, but it isn't any one side, and pretending otherwise would be wrong. Thanks for watching.